Hello, sweet friends, and welcome back to the Quilter's Candy Shop, where you will find sweet treats for the discerning quilter. I can't wait to get started on all the fun projects I have in store for us this year. We're also going to be tackling the scrap pile from 2024. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I hope you'll join me. But today we are going to be doing a quickie little table runner that'll be good for a coffee table topper, a kitchen table centerpiece, or even a pretty mat for the top of your dresser. This pattern is called Checkered Past, and it's part of my charming little table runner pattern. You really don't need a pattern for this quick mat, but when these patterns are finished, they will be available online in our quilt shop at thequilterscandyshop.com. That's SHOPPE shop.com. Although the pattern is designed to work with a 2.5-inch mini charm pack, it's also a good pattern to use with scraps. I'm going to be using a 2.5-inch mini charm pack, but you can easily pull out a wide variety of scraps and cut 42 2.5-inch squares from some medium to dark scraps and 42 2.5-inch squares from some light to medium scraps. It also looks terrific with just 3 fabrics, a light, a dark, and an accent color, if you have some larger pieces in your stash. Well, I have 42 2.5-inch squares of the Arrival of Winter collection, and I have some leftover background from a couple of other projects, which I will cut into 42 2.5-inch squares. Just like that. Step 1 is to set these 2 piles right by your sewing machine and match a print piece with a background piece, right sides together, and chain stitch the entire stack with a 1/4-inch seam. Go ahead and press the seam allowances toward the print piece and away from the background. Once you've sewn and pressed the entire pile, it is time to work out your layout. You're going to make a row with 7 across the top and all of the prints on the right and all of the backgrounds on the left. So the first row starts with a background. The second row starts with a print like this. So you're going to make alternating rows, starting with an A row that starts with a background and alternating with a B row that starts with a print for 6 rows. Oops. Double check and make sure all of your prints are facing the right direction. So this way they're all on the right, and this way they're all on the left. Once you get the 2 rows across the top, so you have set up the pattern, then make your units that go vertical for 6 rows. So you have a background row, a print row, another background row, and a print row. Now with these set up in place across and down, it's really easy to fill in the rest of the pattern. Now here I have my layout, and it's very similar to the actual pattern. But you do not have to use this diagonal layout. You can make it scrappy and random, or whatever you like to do with yours. To make patterns, your best bet is to first view this as rows and just lay out randomly the pieces in rows so that you have the proper A row and B rows going in the right direction. And then start moving the pieces around. Because while it looks like these just lay down like this in pairs, they really don't, because this row flips around. So you can see, and once you start laying this out, you'll see it's a little bit of a brain twister. So your best bet is to lay everything down in the rows and then start flipping the pieces to get the layout that you want. Once you're happy with your arrangement, Sew the double square units together end to end to create rows. And the seam allowances are already pressed in the opposite direction, and that's why I had you press each unit before going to layout. Now all of these are pressed this way, and once you have these all sewn together in a row, it'll be very clear which way to press the rest of the seam allowances. That's going to ensure that when you sew these rows together, that these seams are also going to nest perfectly. Here I have all of my double square units sewn together into rows. So now we're going to sew the rows together. My preference is to sew these two together, and these two together, and these two together. And once I have these double row units, then I'll sew this one onto here and this one onto here. And it makes it a little easier to handle than trying to just add one row at a time onto a larger piece. And you can get a lot more accurate intersections for your seams. And now you can also see that these are going to nest perfectly because these seams are going this way and these seams are going this way, and it's all going to just work beautifully. So I'm going to get my rows sewn together and get this center of the mat finished, and then I will come back and we will talk about the borders. Here we have all of the rows sewn together and the mat center is complete. Next, we're going to add the accent border. The directions call for a 1-inch border. That's going to finish at a 1/2 inch. Because the squares are small, I thought this was just a nice way to frame everything. And then we're going to have a border and of course binding. You can make this accent border as large as you like. When you put on the next border, you'll have to measure your top to find out how big to cut the next pieces. It's very simple, and it's the same thing we do with every quilt that we put a border around. This is just on a smaller scale. You need 3 1-inch strips with the fabric, and you're going to sew these together end to end to make one long strip. Now the pattern has you put on the sides and then the top and the bottom, but after having constructed a few of these, I rather like to put the top and the bottom on first, the long ones, and then put the short sides on second. It's a little better use of fabric, and it just works better. I know it's backwards than our usual way we put on quilt borders, but it just really works better. There's no right or wrong way to do it, so you do it how you like. Once you have the accent border applied, next it's time to apply the outer border. The requirement in the pattern for the outer border is 3 strips with the fabric 2.5 inches wide. And of course you will apply those to the sides and the top just the same way you did the accent border. And that's it. Next, you just create a quilt sandwich with the backing, do some quick quilting to hold it all together, and finish by adding the binding to your checkered pass table runner. I have this chunk that came out of my scrap pile, and it's going to be the perfect size to back this table runner. And I've cut 3 strips with the fabric to match the accent border, and that's what I'll use for my binding. And here's a couple variations on the table runner. I'm going to show you next how to put this checkerboard version together, and also this cute vintage one. Now, if you have some bigger chunks of scraps like these here, you can use a little faster technique for putting your checkerboard together. You might have larger amounts like these. This is cut off of the backing fabric that when I took my quilt to the quilter and they squared it up for me, and then they left me these big long strips. You can use these as well. This one was my leftover chunk from my background fabric. Because I cut very efficiently, I ended up with a piece left over, and this was just leftover bits from my trim. So I was able to pull these out of my scrap pile and pull them together, and I'm going to make another version of the checkered pass mini mat. For this one, I'm going to cut nice and long strips off of this one, and then I'm going to cut regular cross strips on this one and sew it onto here. For the best results, sew the strips together alternating from end to end to avoid the rainbow effect that can sometimes happen when you sew strips together. So what I did is when I put my black and my white together as a pair, I started on this end down here. So I started here and here and here. And then when I put my two sets together, I matched up on this end and I sewed here and here. And that kept this from bowing too much. And that's going to make it much easier to cut. Before you cut your 2.5-inch rows from the strip unit, you want to press all your seam allowances to one side. It doesn't matter if you press it this way or that way because it's light, dark, so it's always going to be either on a light or on a dark. And the alternating row is going to get flipped around 180 degrees, so that means your seams are going to nest. So if you try to do something alternating, it's just going to get it confused. So all one direction, and then when you're cutting it, you're going to cut straight across these strips. Now, you probably noticed this fabric has a little bit of directional print, so this is not the best technique if you have directional fabric, unless you don't care. What I just decided is that I wanted to use the fabric and it was going to get cut in small enough pieces that I don't think it's going to matter. And since I'm going to turn half, some of them are going to be facing one way and the other, but it's going to be equal. So I think it's going to work out just fine. So of course, the first thing we have to do is straighten up the end, and I like to use the 2 ruler method. So I just line that up on a line, plop this puppy up here. I'm going to try and get as thin of a cut on there as possible because I want every inch of my rows here. And there we go. Nice. And then it's just 2.5. And of course you want to line up this line, but you also want to keep a check that you've got a line. I try to keep like the middle line on a nice solid line and keep that straight all the way down so the rows don't start to tip one way or another, because it's very easy to do. So try to keep one line centered up and then 2.5. And I'm just going to slide this down here like that, and 2.5, and then put a line right here, lined up, and 2.5. And I'm just going to keep cutting all the way down. Now when I move this row, I'm going to go ahead and flip it, and see, it's going to automatically make a checkerboard. I'm going to cut one more so you can see it. Line up this line, find a straight line, keep these straight so they're, because you want to make that checkerboard look really nice and clean. You want to make sure these lines are super perpendicular to, oops, I don't have to train that one. This one goes like that. You want to make sure this line and these lines are super exactly perpendicular to each other, because as soon as they get a little off, you lose the beautiful clean checkerboard effect. Okay, I'm going to keep cutting until I have 14 rows just like this. And now I've got all my rows cut at 2.5 inches. Another benefit of this technique is because you're using like those really long strips or a full width of fabric strip, you can actually cut more pieces. You're not limited to 42, which is the 14 rows. You can actually get 16 rows out of a 42-inch wide strip. So I went ahead and cut the extra 2 strips and put it on here. So this one's going to be a little longer because I wanted to use up as much fabric as possible. That's the whole point of using up scraps. All right, I'm going to sew these together. So I like to just pair up, starting at the top. I'm going to sew these 2 together, these 2, etc., and then I'll sew my pairs together, then my quads together, etc. You'll see it. Here it comes. So first I sew all my strips into pairs, and now I'm going to sew my pairs into fours. And once I have the quads put together, then I'm going to put these together in pairs like this and this, and I'll sew these, and then I'll sew these two pieces together, and I'll have the inside of my mini mat complete. And here it is, the completed inner portion of our mini mat. And now the rest of this goes together just the same as the first one. We're going to put on the small inner border all the way around, and then we'll add the outer border. And here it is, all finished. The top of my topper is complete. Now here's another variation. The pattern shows the outer border being made with the light or the background fabric, but it can also be made with the stronger feature fabric. And that's what I've done here. It makes it a little bit more dramatic and elegant. All that's left is to make my quilt sandwich, do some quick quilting, and bind. Here it is, all finished and quilted. I just did straight line quilting across at about 3/8 of an inch away from the seam, which is basically just the half width of my presser foot. Put the edge of my presser foot on the seam line and stitched. And I think it looks great. It actually adds a little dimension to the checkerboard. So you can clearly see when you have just two fabrics, you get a stronger checkerboard effect, but I still used up a nice chunk of scraps. Another variation is to use all similar toned squares in the center. Whether the squares are all scraps like this one, or half of the squares are scraps and half of the squares are a similar toned focus fabric, it gives the whole quilt a real vintage look. To create this inside, you need a total of 84 2.5-inch squares. And lastly, instead of making a solid border here, like in the two previous examples, this one uses 2.5-inch squares inside that border for a little piece and scrappy border. If you'd like to try a 2.5-inch square border, you have to make one change, and that is to make your inner border a little larger. Cut your strips at 1.5 and finish at 1, so the 2.5-inch squares will line up perfectly. To create a 2.5-inch square pieced border, you will need an additional 48 2.5-inch squares. Here's just 3 examples of what you can do with this simple little pattern, and you can come up with more variations on your own. These are so fast and easy. You can make one for every friend and family member and really use up those scraps this year. And if you'd like to pick up a few 2.5-inch squares to make some of these, find us at www.thequilterscandyshop.com. That's SHOPPE shop.com. Well, I hope you enjoyed our checkered past mini mat tutorial. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can see more quilty fun ideas like this. Now, go make something sweet. Bye!